Right. So hello, Professor Koellner. Thank you for accepting my invitation.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Today, we're going to discuss a very famous argument of Roger Penrose that is quite popular online. It's about the relationship between the Gödel's incompleteness theorems and the human mind. But before we get into the core of the discussion, can you please tell us what the incompleteness theorems say?
Yeah, the incompleteness theorems in one formulation say that if you take a system like piano arithmetic, which is a basic formal system concerning number theory, and you assume that it's consistent, the first incompleteness theorem, if you assume it's a little bit more than consistent, you get that it can't decide a certain sentence. So to provide the motivation, prior to the incompleteness theorems, one might have thought that you could write down the basic axioms of mathematics, and that just by dint of pure reason, you'd be able to prove or refute every question concerning mathematics. And the incompleteness theorems came along and exploded that hope by showing that in the most general form, even if you take a very weak system, so they applied pretty much any system. Once you get past a certain amount of mathematical strength, enough to formulate the basic notions of number theory, then if the system's consistent, there's going to be sentences that it can't settle. And one of the sentences that it can't prove is the very statement that the system is consistent, which is something that you can formulate in number theory.
And why did it ever cross anyone's mind to take this sort of results in mathematical logic and apply it to the study of the mind?
Well, the thing is, when you reflect on the incompleteness theorems, you see that the sentence shown to be out of reach of the system is really not out of reach of us. So right after he proved the theorems, Gödel said that this does not at all show that these sentences in question are absolutely undecidable. They're just relatively undecidable. So the system can't capture it, but upon reflection on the outside, we can. And then that makes it look like, at a first pass, that we are able to do something that any system can't do. So we're able to see, for any system, we're able to see a truth that that system can't see. And since there's a correlation between mathematical formal systems and Turing machines, they can go back and forth between the two, that makes it look like for any Turing machine that's writing down truths of number theory, we're able to write down or divine a truth that that machine can't reach. So it's a very tempting idea.
What is this relationship between formal systems and Turing machines? Because I've heard it mentioned a couple of times, but I've never seen it explicit.
Okay, so but what we mean by a formal system is really a recursively enumerable set of axioms, and that's you can also look at not just the axioms, but all the things that are provable from the axioms. So the axioms and the consequences of the axioms is going to be a recursively enumerable set. And one formulation of what it means to be recursively enumerable is just the output of a Turing machine. So there's these basic notions of recursion theory that are all quite closely related.
Right. So I had a look at the papers in Journal of Philosophy, both of them being called on the question of whether the mind can be mechanized. I'm interested in that curious word being mechanized there. What do you mean by the mind being mechanized?
Okay, so it's a bit of a tantalizing title, but I'm very clear at the beginning of the paper that I'm only interested in a very specific version of the question. Since we're talking about something that could be deduced by that could purportedly be deduced from the incompleteness theorems, you're only going to, it makes sense to focus on this particular specific version of the question. So the question I'm interested in is whether the incompleteness theorems imply that the mathematical outputs of the idealized human mind do not coincide with the mathematical outputs of any idealized finite machine. So I'm not looking at the question of, for example, the way a mind captures truths. I'm just looking at the outputs. And I'm only looking at the outputs of mathematics. I'm not looking at normative outputs, and I'm not looking at anything having to do with the ability to grasp concepts or to fall in love or to have that eureka feeling. I'm only addressing a very specific version of the question, one that the incompleteness theorems might have bearing on, because the incompleteness theorems aren't going to tell you whether anything about love or anything like that. So the version of the question is that whether the incompleteness theorems imply that the mathematical outputs of the idealized human mind outstrip the mathematical outputs of any idealized finite machine. And we know what we mean by idealized finite machine because we've got a very precise mathematical regimentation of that informal idea, thanks to Turing's work in 1936, so in terms of the Turing machine. The other part of the equation, the mathematical outputs of the idealized human mind, is more difficult. And that's something that I get into at the end of the second of the two-part paper.
Right. And is the answer to this question that you address in the titles of your papers one that cognitive scientists or philosophers of mind, should they be interested in the answer to this question, where there are so many abstractions made that the human mind, as we know it, is not touched in the arguments?
Yeah, in the end, I conclude that the notion at play here in these arguments, which use the incompleteness theorems to argue for this claim, the notion of the idealized human mind is really something that's hard to get a grip on. It's hard to make sense of the idealized part of that. And so in the end, I argue in the more philosophical part of the paper that one might as well be talking about the angelic mind. Here I can say something about that. In the case of the idealized finite machine, what do we mean by idealized? Well, Turing wrote down the conditions of a machine, and then you relax limits on time and space. So it can be arbitrarily large. It can have more than 10 to the 100 inner components, which is more than the number of atoms in the observable universe. So it can be vastly larger than the things that are in the observable universe. So we know what we mean when we're idealizing in that case. Just as when we're talking about a frictionless plane, we have a good grip on the concept of friction, and then we let friction go to zero. And in the limit, we have a frictionless plane. So in those cases, I understand what it means to talk about the idealized finite machine and the idealized or the frictionless plane, because I have a grasp on the lines along which we're idealizing. But when you start talking about the idealized human mind, it becomes much more delicate. It's not clear what lines one's idealizing along. And the reason it's not clear is that we just don't understand a lot about the human mind. You'd have to have a very good grip on what the basic features of the human mind were if you were going to start idealizing it by relaxing considerations of space and time.
Right. Before we get into the Penrose's main arguments, can we please get into one of the first generation of arguments, as you call it, namely the argument that Lucas put forward, because it seems like the first generation of arguments are easier to put to rest, as you say in the first paper, before we get into the subtleties of the more.
Yeah, it'd be good to back up a bit, because Gödel was the first person to consider this, and he argued for a disjunctive thesis. And the disjunction was this: either the mind can't be mechanized in that precise sense that I'm dealing with, or mathematical truth outstrips the human mind. And he argued that that disjunction was a mathematically established fact. That's a quote from him. And he was convinced that the first disjunct was true. So he thought that the mind can't be mechanized. And he also thought that the second disjunct is false. So he thought that human reason is sufficiently powerful to capture all mathematical truths. So you've got three things here. You've got the idealized finite machines, and I represent those by the symbol F for the formal system. And then you have the idealized human mind, and that's represented by K. And then you have mathematical truth.
Why the choice of K?
Pardon me?
Why the choice of the letter K?
For knowledge, I guess. I think that's probably what they use first in the literature, but that it's kind of the standard symbol that is used in epistemic logic in the tradition that I've been looking at. So he thought that he could prove this disjunction, and he believed that the first disjunct was true, which is what Lucas and Penrose are arguing, right? They're arguing that the mathematical outputs of the human mind can't always outstrip the mathematical outputs of a finite machine, and that's what the first disjunct says. And Gödel's saying either that holds, or there's absolutely undecidable sentences, in the sense that there's mathematical truths that the mind can't reach.
So the first disjunct says that there is no formal system whose theorems are the things that we can prove in principle.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, that's one way to put it.
Okay.
And he thought that he could prove this disjunctive thesis. He said it was a mathematical fact. And he said that, however, I don't think that we're in a position right now to argue on the basis of the incompleteness theorems or really anything that the first disjunct holds. But then he has this really intriguing quote where he says, quote, if one could clear up the intentional paradoxes somehow, one could get a clear proof that the mind is not a machine. It's just that at the time, he didn't think that we had an adequate resolution to the intentional paradoxes, by which he means paradoxes concerning type-free notions like type-free truths and a type-free notion of absolute provability. Now, later on, post Gödel, there has been a lot of work on type-free systems. And so what I did is I pulled the Penrose argument into the context of those type-free systems, where one could actually prove definitive results of the form. If your assumptions on the notion of absolute provability in this type-free sense are thus and so, and if your assumptions on the notion of type-free truth are thus and so, then then there's no way to prove the thing you're trying to prove, the first disjunct.
Right, so it's crucial to the argument that you make that you take the notions of relative probability, absolute probability, and truth, and put them in a very precise context where you are able to prove mathematical results or not.
Yeah, that's one of the problems I've had with the debates, namely that the fundamental assumptions on the basic notions that are being employed are never fully articulated. And so it's hard to assess a claim that, that has been made. When they say, here's an argument informally to the effect that the incompleteness theorems show that the mathematical outputs of the idealized human mind outstrip the mathematical outputs of any finite idealized machine. If you don't know what basic assumptions there are in place concerning those notions, it's hard to assess the argument. And so all I do is articulate those basic assumptions. So looking at the arguments, seeing the rules of inference that are made, and then articulating the background system or a background system in which the argument can be executed. And then you can check, right? You can check. Can you, assuming these principles concerning the fundamental notions, F, K, and T, prove or refute the claim that the mind can't be mechanized?
Mm-hmm. So, for instance, in the for the first Lucas argument, you take the principles that you find charitable for your opponent, and you consider an extension of piano arithmetic, the epistemic arithmetic theory, with truth, and then you make sure all the principles very charitable are in there, and then show that it's consistent with this theory, that the first disjunct does not hold, right? So
yeah, that's really work of Reinhardt and Carlson. So Gödel gave informal arguments, just like Penrose and Lucas did. And Gödel argued for 3 claims. The first claim is that if you take any system F, which is sound, so F is only producing truths, then F is a proper subset of T. There's going to be a truth that F can't catch. And the way to articulate that is to say every correct system misses a truth. And remember, our systems are only proving statements about mathematics. And that follows directly from the incompleteness theorems. His second claim is that for any system F, if you know, if you can absolutely prove, if the idealized human mind knows that that system is sound, then F is a proper subset of K. So then you know something that the system doesn't know. And then the third thing he argued for was the disjunction. Now, you can pull this, there's a system called EA+T that was articulated by a number of people independently, including Shapiro and Reinhardt. And in EA+T, you can make sense of F, K, and T, and you've got basic assumptions on F, K, and T. And the assumptions on K, which is the idealized human mind, are really liberal. So, K knows all logical truths, no matter how large they are. So even if they're larger than the number of symbols in them is larger than the number of atoms in the observable universe, K can just knock that out. So if you put more into K, that's going to make it easier for the opponent to argue that K, with these superpowers, outstrips any finite machine. And so that's what I mean by saying that the strength of a criticism is proportional to the degree that it's charitable. If you give the person who's trying to argue that the mind can't be mechanized more and more mind power, like this logical omniscience, then it's going to make their job easier. And if you can show that, in principle, given their background assumptions, they can't prove that, then that's a stronger claim. And so when you articulate the notions of F, K, and T in this formal framework, EA+T, epistemic arithmetic with truth, you can prove Gödel's 3 claims. Mm-hmm. So it's just a nice way of vindicating his claim that it's that disjunction is a mathematical fact. And then you can start looking at whether you can prove the first disjunct. And there it becomes interesting because a very early theorem, there's 3 versions of the mechanistic thesis. And I'm going to state them informally. Mm-hmm. The first is that there's a machine which is given by a finite number of code for the machine, and you know that you are that machine. You know that your outputs coincide with that machine.
Mm-hmm.
And that's refutable in EA+T. Okay, so it can't be the case that there's a machine such that you know that you're that machine. And that's a theorem of Reinhardt. However, Reinhardt also showed that it's consistent with this system EA+T that there is a machine such that your outputs coincide with that machine. So there is an index, E, such that F sub E, the formal system corresponding to E, or you can think of it as the machine corresponding to E, has exactly the same outputs as K, absolute provability. So that shows that in principle, it's impossible to prove what Lucas and Penrose are trying to prove on the basis of these very liberal background assumptions. And then Carlson came along and he proved an even more remarkable result, and that's that it's consistent with EA+T that not only are you a machine, but you know that you're a machine. So there seems to have been a slide from the true claim that there can't be a machine such that you know that you're that machine to the false claim that it's provable in EA+T that you're not a machine.
And what is it about the new argument of Penrose that I don't know, made you expand on your thoughts on the matter? And I mean, what is it about the new argument that you need more heavy machinery to analyze his arguments properly?
It's really that in this system, truth is typed. So the truth predicate can't apply to itself. And when you look at Penrose's new argument, it employs both a type-free notion of truth and a type-free notion of absolute probability, K.
Can you summarize his argument, please, for those people that have never read it?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic argument. I mean, I don't think that in the end it's valid, but I think it's a fantastic argument. So I'll just read the main passage. He says, though I don't know that I necessarily am F, I conclude that if I were, then the system F would have to be sound. And more to the point, F prime would have to be sound, where F prime is F supplemented by the further assertion, I am F. I perceive that it follows from the assumption that I am F, that the Gödel statement, G of F prime, would have to be true, and furthermore, that it would not be a consequence of F prime. But I've just perceived that if I happen to be F, then G of F prime would have to be true, and perceptions of this nature would be precisely what F is supposed to achieve. Since I am therefore capable of perceiving something beyond the powers of F, I deduce that I cannot be F after all. Now this is if you stare at it for a while, it becomes more and more convincing. And it's quite in the earlier generation of arguments. I think before I go into this further, I should say something about the earlier generation of arguments. So one thing you can do is you can criticize a particular argument for a claim. And then another thing you can do is much more general. You can say that there's no legitimate argument for that claim on the basis of these assumptions. And that's what I did in the case of the Lucas Penrose first generation of arguments. So the first generation of argument is really an argument of the form that Gödel gave for his second claim, namely that if you know that a system is correct, then you know something that system doesn't know. Now that's a conditional claim. and you're trying to discharge the antecedent.
Mhm.
But in order to discharge the antecedent, you would have to know that the system is sound. Now, it's not always easy to know that a system is sound.
Mhm.
So knowing a system is sound in part involves knowing that it's consistent. But let's take, as an example, the system piano arithmetic plus the Riemann hypothesis. Now, the Riemann hypothesis is a famous open problem. It's one of the clay problems. And if you can prove it, then you get $1 million. And you might even get more. I don't know. There might be other prizes that have that. And Kreisel showed that it's equivalent to a pi01 sentence. So what all that means is that the system PA plus R is consistent if and only if R is true. So in order to know that that system is consistent, you have to know the Riemann hypothesis. So no one knows that that system is consistent. If they can prove that that system is consistent, then they get $1 million. Now, Lucas and Penrose could argue back against that and say, but look, we're talking about the idealized human mind. Of course, I don't have, I don't know the Riemann hypothesis, and I don't know that that system is consistent, but it's much more plausible that the idealized human mind does. The problem with that is that the idealized human mind would have to know, in order to discharge the antecedent of Gödel's second claim, that it'd have to be able to establish the consistency of any formal system. And the problem with that is that that's equivalent to having an oracle for pi01 truth. And that's something that you can't assume at the beginning of an argument. And then there's the more general criticism that if you take the liberal assumptions of EA+T as your background assumptions governing F, K, and T, then there's in principle no way to prove that the mind can't be mechanized because of the results of Reinhardt and Carlson. And in approaching the second generation of arguments, by which I mean Penrose's new argument, I take the same approach. So first, I have a particular criticism, or that allows you to articulate the background assumptions, and then prove a couple of no-go theorems to the effect that there's no way to establish the conclusion on the basis of those assumptions.
So what do you take to be the explicit assumptions about truth and absolute probability and relative probability that you can accommodate in the mathematical framework that you have in your second paper that addresses the second generation of arguments?
It's difficult. If you look at his argumented in truth in a type-free yourself to one of the many systems of type-free truth. And so I picked one, which is called DT. It's a system due to Pfefferman, and it's related to KF. It's a particularly nice system because it has all of the Tarskian biconditionals if you condition on determinateness. So the difficulty is when you enter the realm of type-free truth, there's these pitfalls. You can run into sentences that are not determinate and are provably not determinate. Like the liar sentence ends up being provably not determinate. And that's just a feature of systems of type-free truth. So the first thing I did was I took the system of type-free truth, Pfefferman, and I just attached to it the theory of absolute provability, where you treat it as an operator, just like in the Reinhardt systems. And then what happens is you get an inconsistent system.
Mm-hmm.
If you add a simple principle connecting knowledge and truth, just the principle that says that if you know something, it's true. And you get an inconsistent system. And in retrospect, it's kind of clear because the axioms governing K, or absolute provability, are unconditional axioms. But once you enter the realm where you've got indeterminate sentences, you should condition all of your axioms on the determinateness of the statements, which is what happens in the truth part. So you get all the Tarskian biconditionals. If it's determinate, then it holds if and only if it's true. And so what you would want to do is condition your axioms of knowledge on determinateness. Otherwise, you just get an easy inconsistency. And curiously, when you do that, you get a consistent system, but you're also able to treat absolute provability as a predicate. Whereas there's these no-go theorems due to like Montague and Reinhardt and Gödel, which show that you have to, in a certain context, treat knowledge or absolute probability as an intentional operator, not a predicate. Otherwise, you run into inconsistency. But if you're dealing with absolute probability in a context where you're also dealing with truth, and you've got a type-free theory of truth, then you can use the solution that your type-free theory gives to the paradoxes to give a solution to the paradoxes of type-free knowledge. So you tether the system of truth in such a way that the solution that your type-free theory of truth is giving you to the paradoxes of truth gets mapped over to a solution that allows you to skirt the predictions that Gödel, Reinhardt, Thompson, and others came up with for knowledge or absolute probability. And you can look at the Penrose argument. And when you do, you find out that it applies at two steps, principles that only apply to statements if they're determinate. And then so you look and you look at the statements to which he applies those two rules, and then you can show that they're provably indeterminate.
What are those?
It's these two lines. One of them is that if K coincides with the system f of E, then f of E plus, which is the system f of E where you add I am f of E, is sound. That is one of the statements that he applies the inference rule to, and that's provably indeterminate.
How do you translate in your theory a statement such as I am a specific formal system?
So we've got that K is a predicate, and we have that F sub E is a predicate. And to say that I am F of E, remember K is representing to you, that's a sort of shorthand and formal way of saying that the outputs of K coincide with the outputs of F of E. So for any statement in the language, K holds at that statement if and only if F of E holds at that statement. That's what it is to say I am F of E. It sounds more profound when you say I am F of E, right? But it's really just saying that the outputs of the two of you, the thing K, are the same as the outputs of F of E. So yeah, that's the problem. And in general, it turns out that if you look at the general version of the first disjunct in this context, namely the statement that I am the outputs of K outstrip the outputs of any machine, that ends up being provably indeterminate.
Right, so this is the main problem that you take with Penrose's argument, that he makes moves that are only legitimate if the statements in questions will be determinate.
Yeah, but then there's a patch. What he can do is he can restrict the disjunction and the first disjunct and the second disjunct to a sublanguage, which is determinate. And when you do that, if you restrict to the language of arithmetic, then what you get is you get that the system DTK proves that the disjunction is determinate, and it proves that each of the disjuncts are determinate. And in fact, it also proves the determinate version of the disjunction. So now you've got determinate statements, and you can ask whether in this system of type-free truth and knowledge, you can establish, either of the disjuncts. And the theorem is that if you assume that DTK is correct for arithmetical statements, then DTK can neither prove nor refute either disjunct. So again, it can prove the disjunction, but it can't prove or refute either disjunct. And the first disjunct is the one that they're targeting. And then what you can do is you can start adding extensions, looking at beefing up the assumptions on DTK, and I do that, and consider a bunch and get a consistent system and show that it still can't settle them one way or another. And then what you can do is you can try helping yourself to a different type-free theory of truth. You can't quantify over all possible type-free theories of truth, but I give high-level and principal reasons for thinking that none of the ones on offer will give you a system that will settle this question.
And do you think that we might have an appropriate theory of truth and I don't know, a theory in which we will be able to prove something that Penrose would be very happy with, even though we don't have it on the logic market yet?
No, I don't think so. In looking at this, and the theorems have a general form, and it looks like you're not going to be able to prove the statement in a non-question begging way. It's similar to the case with the first generation of arguments. In order to discharge that antecedent and know, for any system to know that system, whether or not that system is correct, you'd have to have a pi01 oracle for truth, and that just begs the question. If you're going to help yourself to that, then you're done.
Right.
So I don't see a route to proving this by some kind of clever argument. It's a novel type-free theory of truth and absolute probability.
I'm still thinking about your claim that by discussing everything in a theory such as DTK or EA+T, you're actually doing a favor to your opponent. And I'm wondering whether you think Penrose would really be on board with that, because it seems to me that no participant to the discussion would doubt the worthwhileness of making the notions precise. So I don't know, all these principles. But when you're equating absolute provability with what you're being able to prove in the setting of EA+T, say, I think that someone like Penrose would believe that you're making his notion of probability a bit weaker. Of course, I guess you might say that then I'd have no clue what you mean by probability if not this. But I guess your opponent does not, well, I haven't looked too much into this, but I guess your opponent does not take probability to be whatever can be proved in a specific formal system. I guess this makes his notion of...
No, that if we did that, then that would be unfair. I mean, because we'd be doing the opposite of helping ourselves to a pi01 oracle for truth. We would be right from the beginning forcing K to be RE. But it's important to distinguish between what's provable in EA+T about K and what K can do. So the EA+T establishes general truths concerning K, but it doesn't force it to be RE. So I mean, the things that are provable about K, the general principles, are going to be RE, but it doesn't follow that that K is RE. It's just like, for example, in recursion theory, you use formal systems to prove things about things that are certainly not RE. But in using a formal system, you're in an RE way getting at truths about something that is definitely not RE.
Perhaps someone who might argue for a Penrose-like conclusion would wouldn't want to associate himself with any effectively formalized theory, whether it is EA+T or DTK or anything of this sort. Perhaps his notions are more informal than those precise ones, because philosophy of mathematics and mathematical logic is special in this respect, because you will never see an ethicist or some other philosopher judging the arguments of the opponent in a formal theory or something like that. It's sort of a more informal, sort of meta-like argument. Of course,
Yeah.
it's good to be precise, but perhaps
Okay, I think there's a distinction that's related to the one that I just mentioned. So the one I mentioned was whether if you're talking in an RE way about a notion, then that notion is RE. That's definitely not true. The related distinction is whether if in talking in an RE and hence precise way about a notion, then that notion has to be precise. Now that's also not true. In fact, I think that the notion of absolute provability, namely K, is not precise. I mean, all I'm asking of the opponent is to articulate what they're assuming about this imprecise notion. So I agree that the question of the mathematical outputs of the idealized human mind is not a precise notion. And I'm not making that notion precise. I'm leaving it imprecise, but I'm articulating the assumptions of the argument and the steps of the argument. Now, if their response is, okay, I'm going to give an argument, but I don't want to lay my cards on the table. I don't want to tell you what I'm assuming about fundamental notions, and I don't want to tell you the rules of inference. It's like that T-shirt, right? You know, the person's writing the equation on the board, and then there's like an explosion, and they say a miracle happens, and then it continues. That's not a good argument, right? We want to know what the starting points are, and how you can get from one thing to the other. And I think that the people putting forward these arguments would agree with that. I mean, certainly Penrose would agree in his mathematical work. He's very precise. I mean, when he proved the singularity theorems, he had to get very precise about what you meant by a singularity and the different things you could mean.
Why do you think Penrose still clings to the argument despite logicians usually not endorsing them?
Well, it really depends on whether you're considering the first generation or the second generation of argument. I think that he probably agreed that there was a problem with the first generation, but that he always had this second argument in mind. And not many people really engage with the second argument. When they do engage with it, they tend to say that, oh, he's using a type-free notion of truth, and those are problematic. And then that's the end of the story. But no one, to my knowledge, has said, as I do, but we have type-free theories of truth. So let's take a system, let's take one and see what we can make of his argument. So to be really, ultimately charitable. And I think that the second generation argument is his new argument, is I'm hoping that when he sees, the paper, that he'll be convinced. And because it's very tricky when you start dealing with type-free notions. You can make subtle mistakes. It's just kind of like tricky when you're dealing with singularities. You can fall into it's like the liar paradox and these anomalous senses are like singularities. Reinhardt actually used that metaphor in his work. No, Gödel used that metaphor. Gödel said that maybe we should try to think of the paradoxical statements in a type-free setting as singularity. So yeah, you can easily fall into a singularity when you're dealing in this type-free context where you've got the true theoretic analog of black holes.
there are some authors who go against Penrose and use the incompleteness theorems to illuminate how the mind works. The most famous work in this respect, I think, is Douglas Hofstadter's Gödel-Escher-Bach. Do you think that people who think that Gödel's incompleteness theorems hold the key to understanding the workings of the mind are even more mistaken than than Penrose?
One won't have to go through case by case, and it's been a long time since I've read Gödel-Escher-Bach. That's actually how I got, in a strange way, into the subject. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an artist, and my parents didn't want me to be an artist. So my dad had a scientist friend talk to me and gave me Gödel-Escher-Bach, hoping it would get me interested in science and things like that. So I just read all the parts on Escher. And then later on, when I heard Bach, I read all the parts on Bach. And then it was only accidentally that I started reading the parts on Gödel. And then when I did, I got really hooked. But that was a long time ago, and I don't remember the details and the use to which he puts the incompleteness theorems in illuminating the mind. But I do remember he wrote this book, I'm a Strange Loop, and the self-referential aspect.
Yeah, and this one.
That appears in completeness theorems is, illuminate something that the mind does. I do think probably that it does. I mean, phenomenologically, we're always like popping out of the box, so to speak. I mean, I'm not, really in a position to say much more of that because I just don't know much about how the mind works.
Right. So I think that was it. I think I understood more about why Penrose's arguments are quite subtle, but ultimately they don't work. And I think
I wish I had been clear, but
and I think and hope that the listeners are also more clear about this subject. So I want to thank you again for joining me today on my podcast.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Enjoy.
I wish you a good day.
You too.
Bye.